The sun was setting over a small, picturesque town tucked away in the Midwest. Maple trees, their leaves painted in hues of orange and gold, lined the streets that led to the heart of the community, a park often bustling with laughter and chatter. But today, the park was quieter than usual, save for the soft rustling of the breeze through the swings and the distant hum of cars on the main road. Alana, a bright-eyed, 10-year-old black girl, sat on a bench with her favorite book, legs dangling above the ground. Her father, Marcus, had promised to get her ice cream from the truck parked just outside the park gates. As she waited, her dark, curly hair caught the glint of the fading sunlight, and her wide smile reflected the simple joy of a peaceful afternoon. She hummed softly, a melody her mother used to sing, while her eyes wandered to the kids playing on the swings and slides. A few yards away, Officer Jack Harris leaned against his patrol car, watching. His steely blue eyes scanned the park with an almost predatory precision. Jack wasn't new to the town, he'd been with the local police for years, building a reputation that was feared rather than respected. For him, the badge was a license, not to protect and serve, but to dominate and impose. His gaze settled on Alana, alone, black, and vulnerable, a combination that, to Jack, made her a perfect target. Jack strode over to Alana, his boots crunching against the gravel path. The air seemed to shift, the warmth of the late afternoon giving way to a chill that crept into Alana's chest. She looked up as he approached, sensing the change before she understood it. "You lost, kid?" Jack's voice was rough, his tone edged with condescension. Alana shook her head, clutching her book a little tighter. "No, sir, I'm waiting for my dad. He's just getting ice cream." Jack smirked, crouching slightly to meet her eye level. "All alone out here? That's dangerous. You know, we've got troublemakers in this park sometimes." Alana frowned, unsure whether he was trying to warn her or scare her. "My dad will be back soon," she said, her voice steady despite the unease building inside her. Jack leaned closer, his breath smelling faintly of tobacco. "Let me guess, he left you here because he doesn't care enough to keep an eye on you?" Alana's jaw tightened. "My dad loves me," she said firmly. Jack's smirk widened, his gaze darting to the book in her hands. "A smart one, huh? Let's see how smart you really are." He reached into the bag slung over his shoulder and pulled out a bottle of liquor, its amber contents glinting ominously in the light. "Bet you've never seen one of these up close. Why don't you give it a try?" Alana's eyes widened. "No, I don't drink. That's not what I asked," Jack said, his tone darkening. He unscrewed the cap, the sharp scent of alcohol cutting through the air. "Go on, take a sip, or do I need to call your daddy to teach you some manners?" Tears prickled at the corners of Alana's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Please, just leave me alone," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jack's face twisted into a sneer. "You don't tell me what to do, little girl." At that moment, a shadow fell across the scene. Marcus, carrying a cone of vanilla ice cream, froze mid-step as he took in the sight of his daughter trembling in front of a uniformed officer. His sharp instincts, honed from years on the force, kicked in immediately, but the rage that surged through him was deeply personal. "Hey!" Marcus's voice rang out, deep and commanding, cutting through the tension like a blade. "What the hell is going on here?" Jack turned, startled, and his sneer faltered when he saw Marcus, a tall, broad-shouldered black man in a crisp, tailored jacket. His initial instinct was to dismiss him, but something about Marcus's authoritative presence made him hesitate. "Stay back," Jack barked. "This is police business." Marcus strode forward, his eyes blazing. "Police business? With a child? That's my daughter." Jack's eyes widened briefly, but he quickly masked his surprise with a smirk. "Well, you should have been watching her more closely. She was acting suspicious." "Suspicious?" Marcus's voice was cold now, each word cutting like glass. He dropped the ice cream cone and stepped between Jack and Alana, shielding her with his body. "You're telling me my 10-year-old daughter, reading a book in a park, looked suspicious?" Jack faltered, but his arrogance refused to let him back down. "Look, I was just..." "Shut up." Marcus's voice was a low growl now, the fury barely contained. "Do you know who I am?" Jack blinked, confused, until realization dawned. "No, it can't be. I'm Chief Marcus Reed," Marcus said, his voice steady but full of warning. "The new chief of police. And you've just assaulted my daughter." A crowd had begun to gather, drawn by Marcus's raised voice and the tension radiating from the scene. Some recorded the confrontation on their phones, whispers rippling through the onlookers. Jack's arrogance gave way to panic. "It's not what it looks like." Marcus raised a hand to silence him. "Save it. You're under arrest. Hand over your badge and weapon." "What?" Jack stammered, his face draining of color. "You can't." "I can. And I will," Marcus said, stepping closer until he loomed over Jack. "You've abused your power for the last time." Jack hesitated, his hand hovering near his holster. But one look at Marcus's unflinching gaze made him think better of it. Slowly, he unpinned his badge and placed it in Marcus's outstretched hand. "Cuff him," Marcus said, signaling to a nearby officer who had arrived on the scene. The officer hesitated but complied, shackling Jack as murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. Marcus knelt down beside Alana, gently taking her trembling hands in his. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks as she hugged him tightly. "I was so scared." "Daddy." "I know, baby," Marcus said, his voice softening. "But I'm here now, and I promise, no one will ever hurt you like that again." As Jack was led away in cuffs, Marcus stood, his arm protectively around Alana. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park. But the light of justice had just begun to rise. The park was alive with a medley of sounds, a soccer ball bouncing off feet, squeals of laughter from the playground, and the chirping of sparrows perched high in the trees. For Alana, this park was a sanctuary, a slice of freedom where her imagination could run wild. She often came here with her father after school, reading her books while he sat beside her, flipping through his newspapers or playing chess with locals. Today, though, felt a little different. Marcus had excused himself to grab ice cream from the truck parked just outside the gates. Alana didn't mind being alone for a bit. She was engrossed in her latest adventure story, her legs swinging under the bench. She could hear her father's voice in her mind, teasing her. "How can you read so fast? Do you even stop to breathe?" She would always grin and respond, "Stories don't wait, Dad." Nearby, the swing swayed lightly in the wind. Abandoned for the moment, the golden hour sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Alana turned a page, her heart racing as the heroine in her book outwitted her enemies. She barely noticed the figure approaching her until his shadow fell across the page. "Hey there, little lady," came the voice, sharp and grating. Alana looked up, startled. The man before her wore a police uniform, his badge catching the sun. His face was rough, with deep lines around his mouth that suggested years of barking orders. His nameplate read, Harris. She didn't know him, but there was something about the way he stood, towering over her, that made her uneasy. "Hi," she said cautiously, clutching her book a little tighter. "Can I help you?" Jack Harris tilted his head, pretending to inspect her. "You're awfully young to be sitting here all by yourself. Where's your mommy or daddy?" "My dad's getting ice cream," Alana said, forcing her voice to sound steady. "He'll be right back." Jack folded his arms, his tone turning patronizing. "That's so? Seems like he's taking his sweet time. You sure he didn't just leave you here?" Alana's heart quickened. "No, he didn't. He's coming back." Jack crouched slightly, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. "You know, little girl, bad things happen when parents aren't paying attention. You never know who might come by." The words sent a chill down her spine. She tried to stand, clutching her book as if it could shield her. But Jack stepped closer, blocking her way. "Sit down," he ordered, his tone suddenly harsh. She froze. Something about his voice, his posture, radiated menace. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound brave. Jack pulled a small flask from his pocket, twisting the cap off with a slow, deliberate motion. The pungent smell of alcohol wafted through the air. "You ever seen one of these before?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock curiosity. Alana's nose wrinkled. "No." "Well, today's your lucky day." Jack shoved the flask toward her. "Go on, take a sip. Let's see if you've got some guts." Alana's stomach churned. "No, I don't drink." Jack leaned closer, his shadow engulfing her. "That's not how this works. When a cop tells you to do something, you do it. Understand? I'm just waiting for my dad," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Jack's face twisted into a sneer. "And I'm just teaching you a little lesson." Life's full of surprises. Better get used to it. She tried to back away, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. Her book slipped from her trembling hands and hit the gravel with a soft thud at that exact moment. Marcus rounded the corner, carrying 2 ice cream cones, one for himself and one for his daughter. He was humming a tune, enjoying the simplicity of the day, when he noticed the scene unfolding near the bench. His steps faltered, the lightness of the moment dissolving into something dark and tense. The ice cream cones fell from his hands, splattering onto the path. Marcus's eyes zeroed in on Alana's tear-streaked face, her body rigid with fear. Then his gaze shifted to the man standing over her, his uniform crisp but his intentions unmistakably cruel. "Hey!" Marcus's voice thundered across the park, startling nearby children and parents. Jack straightened, his hand still gripping the flask. He turned to see Marcus, a tall, muscular man with a commanding presence, striding toward him with a look that could cut steel. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus demanded, his voice low and controlled, but every word laced with fury. "This your kid?" Jack asked, his smirk returning. "She was just acting a little off. Thought I'd check things out." Marcus's jaw clenched. "By threatening her? By forcing her to drink?" Jack's smirk wavered. "Relax, man. Just trying to teach her a lesson about respect." Marcus stepped between Jack and Alana, shielding her with his body. "Respect? You think terrorizing a child teaches respect? Let me show you what respect looks like." Jack's hand instinctively moved toward his holster. But Marcus didn't flinch. "You'd better think carefully about your next move," Marcus said, his voice like granite, "because you're already in more trouble than you can imagine." Jack hesitated, then dropped his hand. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it. Just a little fun." "Fun?" Marcus took another step forward, forcing Jack to back away. "You're done. Badge. Now." "What?" Jack blinked, caught off guard. "You can't." "I can. And I will." Marcus pulled out his own badge, revealing his position as the new chief of police. "Chief Marcus Reed, and you're under arrest for assaulting a minor." The color drained from Jack's face. "I didn't. Save it for your lawyer." Marcus snapped. "Cuff him." He barked the command to a nearby officer who had arrived on the scene. Drawn by the commotion, the officer hesitated, glancing between Marcus and Jack. But Marcus's glare left no room for argument. Jack protested as the cuffs snapped around his wrists, his bravado evaporating into nervous stammering. The growing crowd murmured, their phones out, recording every second. Some whispered in shock. Others voiced their support for Marcus with Jack subdued. Marcus turned back to Alana. She was still standing by the bench, her small frame shaking with silent sobs. He knelt in front of her, his large hands gently resting on her shoulders. "Alana," he said softly, his voice a stark contrast to the commanding tone he had used moments before. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, but her tears didn't stop. "I was so scared, Daddy." Marcus pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly as she clung to him. "I'm here now, baby. No one will hurt you. Not while I'm around." For a moment, the world around them faded, the crowd, the whispers, the weight of what had just happened. It was just a father and his daughter, holding on to each other as the sun dipped below the horizon as Marcus stood, lifting Alana into his arms. He addressed the gathering crowd. "This isn't just about my daughter," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is about every child, every person who's ever been made to feel powerless." "This stops here." The crowd erupted into applause, some cheering Marcus's name. The video recordings would go viral within hours, sparking conversations far beyond the small town. As Marcus carried Alana away from the park, his resolve hardened. He wasn't just going to punish Jack Harris. He was going to root out the rot in his department and rebuild it from the ground up, for Alana, for his community, and for every person who deserved better. The battle had only begun. Marcus sat in his office late into the night, the dim light from his desk lamp casting shadows across the room. The weight of the day lingered heavily on his shoulders. The scene at the park played over and over in his mind, his daughter's frightened face, Jack Harris' smug expression, and the crowd's stunned silence as he arrested the man. He clenched his fists, anger bubbling up again, but he forced himself to focus. This wasn't just about Jack Harris anymore. It was about everything he represented. Jack's personnel file lay open before him. Marcus flipped through its pages, his eyes scanning years of performance reviews, commendations, And complaints. Something didn't add up. Jack had a handful of glowing reviews from higher-ups. But these were interspersed with alarming complaints from civilians, allegations of misconduct, excessive force, and racial profiling. All of them had one thing in common. They were dismissed or marked unsubstantiated. Marcus's jaw tightened as he leaned back in his chair. He had seen this before in other cities. Officers like Jack who operated with impunity because the system shielded them. It wasn't enough to discipline Jack. Marcus needed to dismantle the culture that allowed men like him to thrive. He picked up his phone and called Rachel, the department's records clerk, a woman known for her attention to detail. "Rachel, I need every report, every complaint, every piece of evidence connected to Officer Jack Harris. And I want to know who signed off on dismissing them." There was a pause before Rachel responded, her voice cautious. "Chief, that's a lot of digging. People might not like what comes up." Marcus's voice was firm. "I don't care who it upsets. Get me everything, at home." Alana was unusually quiet. She sat curled up on the couch, her book abandoned on the coffee table. Marcus had tried to comfort her, but he could see the fear lingering in her eyes. His strong, confident little girl now seemed fragile, as though the world had stolen some of her light. That evening, Marcus knelt beside her. "Sweetheart, can we talk?" Alana nodded hesitantly. "I want you to know that what happened today wasn't your fault." Marcus said gently, "What that man did was wrong, and I'm going to make sure he pays for it. But I need to know how you're feeling." Alana looked down, her fingers playing with the hem of her shirt. "I was scared," she whispered. "I thought he was going to hurt me. I didn't know what to do." Marcus's heart broke at her words. He reached out, taking her small hands in his. "You were so brave, Alana, braver than most grown-ups would have been in your shoes. I'm so proud of you." Her lip quivered, and tears welled up in her eyes. "Why did he do it? Daddy? Why does he hate me?" Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Some people judge others because of the color of their skin or where they come from. It's wrong, but it happens, and that's why we have to stand up to people like him." Alana nodded, a small spark of determination returning to her eyes. "I don't want him to do that to anyone else." Marcus smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "He won't, I promise." News of Jack Harris' arrest spread quickly. Videos from the park were shared across social media, sparking heated debates. Some praised Marcus's swift action, calling him a hero for standing up to injustice. Others rallied behind Jack, claiming his actions were misunderstood and that Marcus had overstepped his authority. The town, once seemingly peaceful, was now divided. Protesters gathered outside the police department, their signs reflecting the town's split. "Justice for Alana" clashed with "Support our police." Tensions ran high, and Marcus found himself at the center of it all. One afternoon, Marcus attended a town hall meeting where the community had gathered to voice their concerns. The room buzzed with energy, the air thick with emotion. A man in the back stood up, his voice booming. "Chief Reed, do you really think it's fair to arrest a man like Jack Harris? Who's served this community for years? He's just doing his job." Marcus stood tall, meeting the man's gaze. "If doing his job means intimidating a child and abusing his authority, then yes, I think it's fair, and it's my responsibility as chief to make sure it doesn't happen again." A woman near the front, her voice trembling with emotion, spoke next. "Thank you, Chief Reed. For too long, people like Jack have gotten away with this. My son was stopped by him last year for no reason, and no one listened when we filed a complaint." The room erupted into heated discussions, voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of anger, fear, and hope. Marcus raised his hand, calling for order. "I hear all of you," he said firmly, "and I want you to know that this department will not tolerate abuse of power. But real change takes all of us. We need to work together, to hold each other accountable and to rebuild trust." Back at the station, Marcus faced resistance from within. Some officers, loyal to Jack or fearful of change, avoided him in the hallways. Others whispered behind his back, questioning his authority. But a handful of officers approached him quietly, offering their support. One of them was Officer Linda Torres, a young woman who had joined the force hoping to make a difference but had quickly grown disillusioned. "Chief," she said, stepping into his office, "I want to help. I've seen things in this department that don't sit right with me. If you're serious about cleaning this place up, I'm with you." Marcus looked at her, seeing the earnestness in her eyes. "It won't be easy," he warned. "You'll face pushback, maybe even threats." Linda nodded. "I'm not afraid. This is why I became a cop, to protect people, not to hurt them." Together, they began piecing together the puzzle of corruption within the department. Linda provided information on incidents she had witnessed, and Rachel's research uncovered a disturbing pattern of cover-ups and complicity. It wasn't just Jack Harris. There were others, officers who bent the rules, ignored complaints, and shielded their own from accountability. As the evidence mounted, Marcus realized the scope of the problem was larger than he had anticipated. But he also knew that exposing the truth was the only way to bring about real change one evening. As Marcus prepared to leave the station, he found a note taped to his car windshield. The handwriting was messy, the words hastily scrawled, "Back off, or you'll regret it." Marcus's eyes narrowed as he crumpled the note in his fist. The battle was far from over. But he wasn't about to back down. For Alana, for his community, and for every person who had been silenced, he would see this through, no matter the cost. The sound of rain pattered against the window of Marcus's office as he sat staring at the pile of files spread across his desk. The evidence against Jack Harris was damning. But Marcus knew this wasn't just about one rogue cop. Jack's behavior was a symptom of a deeper, systemic rot that had taken root in the department long before Marcus arrived. Rachel, the department's records clerk, entered his office, balancing a stack of thick folders. She placed them on the desk with a thud. "Chief, this is everything I could find on Jack and any related complaints. But I have to warn you, some of this is messy. A lot of these reports were buried or accidentally misfiled." Marcus nodded, his expression grim. "Thank you, Rachel. This is exactly what I need." He opened the first file and immediately felt his stomach turn. It was a complaint from a young black man named Devin, who had been pulled over by Jack for a supposed broken taillight. According to the report, the stop escalated when Jack accused Devin of being a drug dealer, forcing him out of the car and handcuffing him on the side of the road. No drugs were found, and Devin was released without charges, but not before enduring humiliation in front of a growing crowd of bystanders. Marcus flipped to the next file. It was another civilian complaint, this time from a Latina woman who had been stopped late at night while walking home. Jack had harassed her, questioning why she was out so late and implying she was involved in illegal activities. Again, the complaint had been dismissed as unsubstantiated. Page after page, story after story, painted a picture of abuse, intimidation, and unchecked power. Marcus's anger simmered beneath the surface. But he kept his focus. He couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. He had to be strategic. "Rachel," Marcus said, looking up from the files. "Who signed off on all these dismissals?" Rachel hesitated. "Chief, you're not going to like the answer. Try me." She pulled a sheet from the bottom of the stack and handed it to him. At the bottom of each report was a familiar signature, Captain Frank O'Connell, Marcus's second-in-command at home. Marcus was equally consumed by worry for Alana. She had always been a bright, confident child, but since the incident, she had retreated into herself. He found her in the living room one evening, staring blankly at her book instead of devouring it as she usually did. "Sweetheart," Marcus said gently, sitting down beside her, "how's your story?" Alana shrugged, her shoulders barely moving. "It's okay." Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder. "You know, when I was your age, books were my escape. Whenever the world felt too big or too scary, I'd lose myself in a story." Alana looked up at him, her eyes clouded with doubt. "But what if the scary stuff doesn't go away? What if it keeps happening?" Marcus's heart ached at her question. He thought carefully before answering. "Sometimes the scary stuff is part of the world, Alana, but that doesn't mean we let it win. We fight back, not just for ourselves, but for everyone else who's scared too." Alana was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I don't want to feel scared anymore." Marcus smiled, pulling her into a hug. "You're stronger than you know, baby, and you're never alone. I'll always be here for you." For the first time in days, Alana smiled faintly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next morning, Marcus woke to chaos. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. Videos of the park incident had gone viral overnight, and the town was abuzz with heated debates. Local news outlets picked up the story, plastering headlines like, "Police chief arrests fellow officer for assaulting child," and Community divided over police chief's actions. The comments online were equally polarizing. Some praised Marcus for standing up to Jack and holding him accountable. Others accused him of overreacting and turning against his own. Protesters began to gather outside the police station, their signs reflecting the town's division. One side read, "Justice for Alana," while the other bore slogans like, "Support our police." Inside the station, tensions were no better. Marcus noticed the subtle ways some officers avoided him, muttered conversations that stopped when he entered a room. The sudden silence that followed his footsteps down the hall. But he also saw determination in the eyes of a few, like Officer Linda Torres, who approached him during a particularly tense morning. "Chief," Linda said, closing the door behind her, "I wanted to say thank you." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For taking a stand. I've seen too many things in this department that made me question why I joined in the first place. But you've reminded me why I'm here, to do the right thing." Marcus nodded. "I appreciate that, Torres. But doing the right thing isn't going to make us popular." Linda smiled faintly. "I didn't sign up to be popular, sir. I signed up to protect people." As the days went on, Marcus and Linda worked together to piece together the web of corruption within the department. Linda provided key insights, recounting instances where she had witnessed officers bending the rules or turning a blind eye to misconduct. Meanwhile, Rachel continued to uncover more troubling patterns. It wasn't just Jack Harris. There were other officers with similar records of complaints that had been swept under the rug. And at the center of it all was Captain O'Connell, whose name appeared repeatedly as the final authority on dismissing complaints. One evening, Marcus confronted O'Connell in his office. "We need to talk," Marcus said, closing the door behind him. O'Connell leaned back in his chair, a smug expression on his face. "What's this about, Chief?" Marcus dropped a stack of files onto O'Connell's desk. "This is about you covering for Jack Harris. And not just him. There's a pattern here. Frank, complaints dismissed, evidence buried, victims silenced. You've been protecting bad cops for years." O'Connell's expression darkened. "Watch your tone, Marcus. You're new here. You don't know how things work." "I know exactly how things work," Marcus shot back, "and I'm here to change it." O'Connell stood, his voice low and threatening. "Be careful, Marcus. You might think you're untouchable. But this town doesn't like outsiders coming in and stirring up trouble." Marcus held his ground. "This isn't trouble, Frank. This is justice. And if you're part of the problem, I'll take you down too." O'Connell's jaw tightened, but he said nothing as Marcus turned and walked out of the office later that night. As Marcus was leaving the station, he found a note taped to his car windshield. The words were scrawled in messy, hurried handwriting. "Back off, or you'll regret it." Marcus's fist clenched around the note. But he didn't flinch. He looked up at the darkened street, his resolve hardening. Whoever was behind this thought they could intimidate him, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Marcus sat in his office late into the night. The ominous note crumpled on his desk. The warning was clear, but retreat was not an option. He thought of Alana and the fear in her eyes at the park. If he didn't fight now, if he didn't stand up to this corruption, he'd be failing not only her but every child in the community who looked to him as a symbol of hope. The department was quieter than usual, but the silence felt loaded. As Marcus walked the halls, he caught furtive glances from officers huddled together, their conversations falling silent when he passed. It was becoming clear that some of them resented his presence and the changes he was trying to make. Others, perhaps, were complicit in Jack Harris' unchecked behavior and were worried about what Marcus might uncover. Linda Torres, one of the few officers who openly supported Marcus, knocked lightly on his office door. She stepped inside, her face tense. "Chief, I think you should see this," she said, handing him a flash drive. "What is it?" Marcus asked, plugging it into his computer. "It's a recording," Linda explained. "I've been keeping tabs on some of the guys. There's a group of officers who've been meeting in the break room after hours. They're not exactly subtle about their feelings toward you." Marcus clicked the file, and the audio filled the room. The voices were unmistakable. Captain O'Connell, along with a handful of other senior officers, discussing their disdain for Marcus. "We've got to stop him." O'Connell's voice growled. "This guy thinks he's some kind of hero, coming in here and tearing everything apart. He's making us look bad." Another voice chimed in, one Marcus recognized as Officer Riley. "You want me to take care of it?" "A little. Accident might set him straight. Marcus paused the recording, his jaw tightening. Linda spoke again, her voice filled with concern. This isn't just resistance, Chief. They're plotting something. You need to be careful. Marcus nodded, his face set in a grim expression. Thank you, Torres. Keep your ears open, but be careful. These men won't hesitate to come after you if they think you're helping me. Linda nodded. I can handle myself, Chief, but you're the one they're targeting. The next morning, Marcus was summoned to City Hall for an emergency meeting with Mayor Judith Marlowe. A sharp, no-nonsense woman in her late 50s. She greeted Marcus with a firm handshake, her expression unreadable. Chief Reed, thank you for coming, she said, gesturing for him to sit. I've been following the situation closely. Marcus sat down, his posture straight. I assume you're referring to the arrest of Jack Harris and the backlash from the department. That, and the protests outside the station. Marlowe replied. The community is divided, and the media isn't helping. I've had calls from concerned citizens, some demanding your resignation. Marcus raised an eyebrow. And what do you think? Mayor Marlowe? She leaned forward, her piercing gaze meeting his. I think you're doing what this town desperately needs. But it's a dangerous game you're playing. Chief, you're not just taking on a corrupt officer. You're challenging an entire system that's been in place for decades. Marcus's voice was calm but firm. With respect, Mayor, that's exactly why I took this job. If we don't challenge the system, it'll keep failing the people it's supposed to protect. Marlowe nodded, her expression softening slightly. I believe in what you're doing, Marcus, but you need to tread carefully. The old guard won't go down without a fight. I'm prepared for that, Marcus said, determination etched in his voice. Marlowe leaned back, considering him. Then you have my support. But if things escalate, I'll need to see results quickly. The public's patience is thin. That evening, as Marcus drove home, a pair of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. The car followed him closely. Uncomfortably close. Marcus frowned, gripping the wheel tighter. He took a few unexpected turns, testing whether the vehicle was truly following him. Each time, the car mirrored his movements. As he reached an empty stretch of road, the car behind him accelerated, its headlights blinding. Before Marcus could react, the vehicle swerved toward him, clipping his rear bumper. His car spun out, skidding across the road before coming to a stop in a shallow ditch. Breathing heavily, Marcus checked himself for injuries. A bruise was already forming on his shoulder where the seatbelt had dug in during the spin. But he was otherwise unharmed. He reached for his phone to call for help, but the other car was already speeding away, its taillights vanishing into the darkness. When officers arrived to investigate, Marcus knew exactly what this was, a warning. But instead of fear, he felt a surge of resolve. These cowards thought they could scare him into submission. They were wrong. The attack on Marcus only served to galvanize the community. News of the incident spread quickly, and more people began to rally behind him. Alana, now regaining her confidence, became an unexpected source of inspiration. At a community meeting organized to address the growing divide, she stood beside her father, holding his hand tightly. When Marcus spoke, his voice was steady and passionate. This isn't just about one officer. It's about ensuring that every person in this community feels safe, whether they're walking home at night, driving to work, or simply playing in the park. We can't allow fear and hatred to dictate how we live. A young black woman in the audience stood up, her voice trembling but resolute. Chief Reed, I've lived here my whole life, and this is the first time I've felt like someone in power actually cares about us. Don't stop fighting. Her words were met with applause, and Marcus felt a swell of hope. The community was beginning to see the bigger picture, to understand that this fight wasn't just his, it was theirs back at the station. Rachel and Linda's efforts finally paid off. They uncovered an internal memo from years ago, written by Captain O'Connell, instructing officers to prioritize investigations into complaints against their colleagues. The language was thinly veiled but damning. Marcus gathered his allies within the department, Linda, Rachel, and a few younger officers who shared his vision for reform. Together, they began building a case, not just against Jack Harris but against the entire network of corruption that had allowed him to operate unchecked. Late one night, Marcus received a call from Rachel. Her voice was shaking with excitement. Chief, you're not going to believe this. I found a connection between O'Connell and a private security firm that's been paying him under the table. It looks like he's been using his position to protect their interests. Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the smoking gun he needed. But he knew the fight was far from over. O'Connell and his allies wouldn't go down without a fight as Marcus prepared to present his findings. His phone buzzed with a new message. It was a video, sent from an unknown number. His blood ran cold as he watched the footage, grainy but unmistakable. It showed Alana walking home from school, unaware that she was being followed. The message that accompanied the video was chillingly simple: back off, or she pays the price. Marcus's grip tightened around the phone. His knuckles white. They had crossed a line. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about his family, his community, and the future of justice itself. They want a war, Marcus muttered to himself, his voice low and determined. Then they'll get one. The courthouse buzzed with tension as the trial of Jack Harris began. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and law enforcement officers, some there to support Marcus, others there to back Jack. The air felt thick, charged with a mix of hope and trepidation. Marcus sat beside the prosecutor, his presence commanding but subdued. He was there not just as a witness, but as a father seeking justice for his daughter and as a leader determined to expose the rot within the system. Across the aisle sat Jack, his face pale but defiant, flanked by his lawyer, who was known for defending controversial clients. The prosecutor, a sharp and eloquent woman named Elaine Harper, began her opening statement. This case is not just about a single officer's actions, it's about accountability. It's about drawing the line between those who protect and serve, and those who abuse their power. The evidence will show that Jack Harris crossed that line, not once, but repeatedly. As Elaine spoke, Marcus's mind wandered to Alana. She was at home, safe under the watchful eye of his sister. But her absence in the courtroom felt like a weight on his chest. He couldn't help but think of the day in the park and the fear in her eyes. That memory fueled his resolve. The defense attorney countered, painting Jack as a dedicated officer under undue scrutiny, and accusing Marcus of launching a personal vendetta. Marcus clenched his fists under the table, resisting the urge to respond. The battle had only just begun. The prosecution called its first witness, a young man named Devin, whose complaint against Jack had been dismissed years earlier. Devin recounted the night he was pulled over, his voice steady but tinged with bitterness. "He made me feel like a criminal for no reason," Devin said, his gaze fixed on Jack. "He handcuffed me in front of a crowd, humiliated me, and then let me go like it was nothing. I filed a complaint, but nothing happened. I thought no one cared." Elaine presented the dismissed complaint as evidence, along with similar reports from other victims. The pattern was undeniable. One by one, witnesses came forward, each story adding weight to the case against Jack. As they spoke, Marcus watched the jury's expressions shift: shock, disbelief, and, eventually, indignation. When Marcus took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Elaine guided him through his testimony, starting with his background and his reasons for joining law enforcement. "I became a cop to protect people," Marcus said firmly, "to make sure everyone, no matter who they are, feels safe in their community. But what I've seen in this case, what Jack Harris did to my daughter and others, goes against everything this badge stands for." Elaine then asked about the day in the park. Marcus described the scene in vivid detail, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I saw my daughter terrified, being harassed by someone she should have been able to trust. That's when I knew I couldn't ignore what was happening in this department." The defense attempted to discredit him, accusing Marcus of bias and exaggeration. But Marcus held his ground. "Bias? My bias is for justice. If Jack Harris were innocent, we wouldn't be here." As the trial progressed, Marcus and his allies continued their investigation into the department's systemic issues. Rachel and Linda uncovered more damning evidence, including emails linking Captain O'Connell to a private security firm that had paid him to dismiss complaints against officers like Jack. These findings were presented in court, broadening the scope of the case beyond Jack's individual actions. The revelations sent shockwaves through the town. Protests outside the courthouse grew larger, with community members demanding not only Jack's conviction but also a full overhaul of the police department. Signs reading, "Justice for Alana," and "Reform the System," filled the streets. and chants echoed late into the night. Inside the courthouse, Captain O'Connell was called to testify. He was combative at first, denying any wrongdoing, but under cross-examination, Elaine skillfully dismantled his defense. Presented with the evidence of his involvement, O'Connell finally broke, admitting to years of corruption and cover-ups. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Marcus felt a mix of triumph and sadness. The truth was coming out, but the cost to the community, and to his department, was steep. As the trial drew to a close, both sides presented their final arguments. Elaine's closing statement was powerful, appealing to the jury's sense of justice. This is about more than one man. It's about restoring faith in the institutions meant to protect us. Jack Harris betrayed that trust, and now it's time to hold him accountable. The defense, in contrast, relied on fear and deflection, warning of the dangerous precedent that convicting an officer could set. But their argument rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence. The jury deliberated for hours, and the entire town held its breath. Finally, the verdict was announced. Jack Harris was found guilty on multiple counts, including assault and abuse of power. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. His career in law enforcement permanently ended. For Marcus, it was a bittersweet victory. Jack's conviction was a step toward justice, but it was only the beginning. The fight to rebuild trust and reform the department loomed ahead in the weeks following the trial. Marcus worked tirelessly to implement changes within the department. He dismissed officers implicated in the corruption scandal, promoted Linda Torres to a leadership position, and established a civilian oversight board to ensure accountability. Alana, inspired by her father's courage, began speaking out about her experience. With Marcus's support, she helped organize a youth group focused on empowering young people to stand up against injustice. At one meeting, Alana stood before a group of children and said, "I was scared that day in the park. But my dad taught me something important. Being scared doesn't mean you stop fighting. It means you fight harder." Her words resonated with the community, and Marcus felt a swell of pride. Alana was turning her trauma into a source of strength, not just for herself, but for others. Months later, the town had begun to heal. The police department, now under Marcus's restructured leadership, was slowly earning back the community's trust. Officers attended diversity training, engaged in community outreach, and worked alongside civilians to create a safer, more inclusive environment. At a town hall meeting, Marcus addressed the crowd. "This journey hasn't been easy, and it's far from over. But together, we've proven that change is possible. We've shown that standing up for what's right matters. And we've taken the first steps toward building a community where everyone feels safe." The audience erupted into applause, and Marcus saw familiar faces, friends, allies, and even former skeptics, nodding in agreement. In the front row sat Alana, her smile a reminder of why he had fought so hard. As Marcus left the stage, Linda approached him. "You did it, Chief," she said, a rare smile crossing her face. "We did it," Marcus corrected, glancing at Alana and the crowd beyond her. "And we're just getting started." The courtroom was packed with tension on the third day of the trial. Jack Harris sat rigidly at the defense table, his jaw clenched as the weight of the evidence mounted against him. The prosecution's witnesses were unrelenting, each testimony revealing the breadth of his abuses. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric, a mix of anticipation and simmering outrage. Elaine Harper, the prosecutor, stood before the jury, her presence commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have heard from multiple victims who were silenced for years. Each one of them tells a story not only about Jack Harris but about a system that allowed him to act without consequence." She turned toward Marcus, who sat quietly in the gallery. His testimony had been powerful, but Elaine knew this case required more than just his words. It needed undeniable proof. That proof came in the form of a key witness, Officer Linda Torres. Taking the stand, Linda recounted what she had seen during her time in the department. "There was an unspoken rule," she said, her voice steady. "If you saw something wrong, you looked the other way. Jack Harris wasn't the only one doing it, but he was the worst. And Captain O'Connell protected him." The defense attorney attempted to discredit Linda, suggesting she was biased or seeking personal gain. But Linda stood firm. "I'm not here for revenge," she said. "I'm here because people deserve to know the truth." Outside the courthouse, the streets were filled with protesters. their voices rising in chants. The movement had grown far beyond the incident at the park, fueled by the systemic issues uncovered during the investigation. Banners reading, "Justice for All," and "End Police Corruption," waved in the wind, while speeches from community leaders energized the crowd. Among the protesters was Alana, standing with her aunt. Although she was still young, she insisted on being there, holding a hand-painted sign that read, "Kids deserve to feel safe." She became a symbol of hope for many in the crowd. One of the organizers approached her. "Alana, would you like to say something to the crowd?" Alana hesitated, glancing at her aunt. With a reassuring nod, her aunt encouraged her forward. Alana climbed onto the small stage, her heart pounding. She gripped the microphone tightly and spoke, her voice trembling but clear. "I was scared that day in the park," she began, "but my dad taught me that being scared doesn't mean you stop. It means you have to keep going. And that's what we're all doing here. We're not stopping until things change." The crowd erupted into cheers. And Marcus, watching from a window inside the courthouse, felt a swell of pride. His daughter's bravery fueled his determination inside the courtroom. The defense launched a counteroffensive. Jack's lawyer attempted to paint him as a hard-working officer who had been unfairly targeted in a politically motivated campaign. "This is a witch hunt," the lawyer declared. "My client has served this community for years. These allegations are nothing more than attempts to tarnish his reputation." The defense called a handful of character witnesses, friends and colleagues of Jack, who described him as dedicated and misunderstood. But under cross-examination, Elaine Harper exposed inconsistencies in their stories, revealing their testimonies to be thinly veiled attempts to protect their own reputations. The turning point came when Elaine played an audio recording obtained by Officer Torres. The grainy but audible voices included Jack and Captain O'Connell discussing how to bury complaints against officers. The courtroom fell silent as the words echoed through the speakers. "Just file it under insufficient evidence," Jack's voice said. "These people complain about everything." O'Connell replied, "It's easier that way. Keeps the department looking good." The jury's expressions shifted, their earlier skepticism replaced with anger and disgust. After weeks of testimony and evidence, the case was handed to the jury. The town held its collective breath as they deliberated. Inside the courthouse, Marcus paced the hall outside the courtroom, his mind racing. He thought of everything that had led to this moment, the years of silence, the weight of corruption, and the courage it had taken to bring the truth to light. Finally, the jury returned. The foreperson stood, holding the verdict in their hands. The room fell silent. On the charge of assault of a minor, we find the defendant, Jack Harris, guilty. On the charge of abuse of power, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to cover up misconduct, guilty. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom as the judge pronounced Jack's sentence, 20 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 10. For Marcus, it was justice, though the victory felt bittersweet. Jack was just one part of a much larger problem. In the aftermath of the trial, Marcus turned his focus to rebuilding the department. He dismissed officers implicated in the corruption scandal, bringing in fresh recruits committed to transparency and accountability. Linda Torres was promoted to captain, her integrity and bravery making her a natural leader. Marcus also worked with the mayor to establish a civilian oversight board, ensuring that complaints against officers would be reviewed independently. It was a major step toward restoring trust between the police and the community. But the process wasn't easy. Some officers resisted the changes, and public skepticism lingered. Marcus met with community leaders regularly, listening to their concerns and finding ways to address them. Slowly but surely, the department began to transform. For Alana, life started to return to normal, but she had been changed by the experience. She began speaking at schools and community events, sharing her story and encouraging other young people to stand up for what was right. One evening, as Marcus watched her address a group of kids at a local library, he felt a deep sense of pride. "My dad always says that being scared isn't a reason to give up," Alana said, her voice steady. "It's a reason to fight harder. And together, we can make things better." Her words resonated deeply, and Marcus knew that the fight for justice wasn't just his, it belonged to the next generation. 2 months turned into a year, and the town began to heal. The protests subsided, replaced by a cautious optimism. Crime rates dropped as the police department focused on community engagement and prevention rather than intimidation and force. At a town hall meeting, Marcus addressed the community. We've come a long way. But the work isn't done. Real change takes time, and it takes all of us. Together, we've shown that justice isn't just an idea, it's something we can build. Step by step, the audience erupted into applause, their faces reflecting hope and unity. Among them, Marcus spotted Alana, her smile lighting up the room. She waved at him, and he waved back, his heart full. Later that night, Marcus sat on the porch of their home, Alana beside him. The stars twinkled above, and the air was cool and crisp. Do you think things will stay better, Daddy? Alana asked. Marcus thought for a moment, then nodded. They will, because people like you won't let them go back. Alana leaned against him, her small hand slipping into his. I want to be brave like you. Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with love and pride. You already are, sweetheart. As the town moved forward, so did Marcus and Alana, their bond stronger than ever. The fight for justice had tested them, but it had also brought them closer, leaving a legacy of hope, courage, and resilience. The verdict against Jack Harris sent shockwaves through the town. For some, it was a vindication, a clear signal that the days of unchecked power and systemic corruption were over. For others, it was a bitter pill to swallow. Marcus knew that change was never easy, and the road ahead would be long and fraught with resistance. The morning after the trial, the local newspaper ran a headline that read, "Justice delivered. Officer convicted in landmark case." The accompanying article highlighted not only the outcome but also Marcus's role in bringing transparency and accountability to the police department. While some applauded his efforts, others viewed him as a disruptor, a leader who was dismantling the old ways. In the weeks that followed, Marcus received an anonymous letter at the station. Unlike the threatening notes he had received before, this one bore a different tone. The handwriting was neat, the message brief but heartfelt. Chief Reed, thank you for standing up for us. For the first time in years, I feel like my voice matters. Marcus folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer. It was a small reminder of why he had chosen to fight. Even when the odds were stacked against him as part of his ongoing efforts to reform the department. Marcus conducted personal interviews with every officer still on the force. He wanted to understand their perspectives, their motivations, and whether they were committed to the new direction he was taking the department. Most of the conversations were productive, but a few were tense. One particularly difficult meeting was with Officer Riley, a longtime friend of Jack Harris who had been implicated in several incidents but lacked the hard evidence to warrant dismissal. Riley sat across from Marcus, his posture stiff, his face unreadable. I know you think I'm part of the problem, Riley began, his voice low, but I've been a cop in this town for 20 years. I've seen things you wouldn't believe. And yeah, I didn't always do the right thing. But I've never been like Jack. Marcus leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. Then prove it. This isn't about what you've done in the past, it's about what you're willing to do now. Are you ready to change? Riley hesitated, the weight of his choices clearly visible on his face. Finally, he nodded. I want to make things right. Marcus extended a hand. Then let's start here. While the department worked to rebuild, the community underwent its own transformation. For years, many residents had stayed silent, either out of fear or apathy. But the events surrounding Jack Harris' trial sparked a wave of activism. Town meetings became standing room-only events, with citizens voicing their concerns and proposing solutions. One of the most vocal activists was Ms. Evelyn, a retired schoolteacher in her 70s who had lived in the town her entire life. She stood at the podium during a town hall meeting, her voice firm despite her age. For too long, we've let people like Jack Harris make us feel small, she said, her gaze sweeping the room. But we're not small, we're a community, and it's time we start acting like one. Chief Reed has shown us what accountability looks like. Now it's up to us to demand it, not just from our police, but from ourselves. Her speech earned a standing ovation, and Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat. People like Ms. Evelyn reminded him that real change started from the ground up, inspired by her father's fight for justice. Alana began working on a school project about leadership and bravery. With Marcus's help, she interviewed community leaders, teachers, and even some of the officers who had embraced the department's reforms. During one interview, she asked Linda Torres, What made you decide to help my dad? Linda smiled, her eyes softening. Because your dad reminded me why I became a cop in the first place. It's not about power, it's about helping people. And sometimes, helping people means standing up to the bad ones, even if they're wearing the same uniform. Alana included Linda's story in her project, along with her own reflections on the day at the park. When she presented it to her class, her teacher was so impressed that she suggested Alana share it at the town's annual community fair. On the day of the fair, Alana stood on the small stage, her voice clear and confident as she spoke about courage and standing up for what was right. The crowd erupted in applause when she finished, and Marcus couldn't hide the tears in his eyes. "You're amazing," he told her as he hugged her tightly. "You're the amazing one, Dad," she replied. "I just learned from the best." Despite his confession in court, Captain O'Connell had yet to face the full consequences of his actions. Marcus worked with Elaine Harper to build a case against him, uncovering years of financial records that revealed bribes and kickbacks from private security firms. The evidence was overwhelming, and O'Connell was arrested on charges of corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. The arrest sent a powerful message: no one was above the law. For Marcus, it was another victory, but also a sobering reminder of how deeply the corruption had run. When reporters asked him for a comment, Marcus's response was measured but resolute. Accountability doesn't stop with one trial or one arrest. It's a continuous process, and this department will keep working until we've earned the trust of every single person in this community. A year after the trial, the town celebrated the anniversary of the reforms with a community event at the park where it all began. The air was filled with laughter and the smell of barbecue, a stark contrast to the tension that had once hung over the town. Marcus stood by the playground, watching Alana play with a group of friends. She had come so far since that fateful day, stronger, more confident, and deeply aware of the difference one person could make. Linda Torres approached him, holding 2 plates of food. "Looks like things are finally settling down," she said, handing him a plate. "For now," Marcus replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. "But we can't get complacent. There's still work to do." Linda nodded. "Always." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus took a deep breath, the weight on his shoulders lighter than it had been in months. The fight for justice had tested him in ways he never imagined. But it had also brought him closer to his daughter, his community, and his purpose. Together, they had proven that even in the face of fear and corruption, change was possible. And as Marcus watched Alana laugh and play, he felt a renewed sense of hope for the future.